Hi, team. This is Bailey. We'll get started in just another minute or so.
Bailey, the slides are, this is Donna in Oklahoma City. My slides are, I know that you don't have them up yet, but it's not opening for me. Lotus is.
Oh, okay. It should be up.
I get to the point that it says it's, the page before it shows the slides, and then it just sits there forever. I've closed it a couple of times and come back in, you know, with the passcode and everything, and it just won't open to the place where slides will pop up.
All right. Is anyone else having that issue, or can you guys see the slides?
I just logged in. I can see the slides.
I can see them as well.
Looks like I'll be able to see them here. Yes, I can.
I can see them.
Just worked.
Okay.
Mine continues to say opening web conference window, and it sits here for, you know, quite a while. I've closed it down 4 times now.
It's so odd. I think it's open. Let me open up my email, and I can email you the slides so you'll have them.
Can you see that I'm even logged in?
No, it doesn't show you as logged in either. Do you mind trying it one more time? I'm sorry to have you do it again.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry about that. Hey, Randy, did you start the audio and the record?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. This is Ken. I'm on the line. Sorry I missed yesterday's training. I'm sure it was a good training.
I changed it up a little bit, Ken. I hope you don't mind. We talked a little bit about need in there, too, because I realized that wasn't a piece that we had gone over. And, you know, you can have wonderful employer partnerships, but if they can't define the need in their area, or if there isn't need as we get closer and closer to zero, then you got a big disconnect. So we kind of tag team that dual topic. But we'll have that recording up. Yeah.
Yeah, we're starting to see withdrawals, which is a good thing. You know, folks are getting out of the HVRP business now because they just don't have enough homeless veterans to serve. So it's a good thing.
It is. And a quick note on that, too. I don't know if I told you all, but I'm actually down in Los Angeles at the moment for one of the SSVF surge launches. So the SSVF program has pumped a bunch of money into communities for what they're calling the surge to really make massive progress in the next 7 months to ending veteran homelessness. Just a couple of the interesting things that have come out here. And actually, before we get too far, now that we've got most of the folks on the line, I'm going to go ahead and lock the call so we don't get any other folks that try to call in. So if for some reason you get kicked off, just shoot Ken a note, and Ken, if you wouldn't mind letting me know, and then we can open it back up. But we want to make sure that it stays just locked with us.
I'm actually working from home, and I'm getting ready to catch a flight to Atlanta, so I don't have access to the DOL network or email. I'm just calling in.
All right. Well, shoot Randy an email, or because I don't have my email up either because I'm on my small computer. Randy's email address is rbrown@nchv.org if for some reason you get kicked off. Okay, great. All right, so we are conference secure, and I can tell you a little bit about what's happening in SSVF. You know, hot off the presses, I was just in the opening session, and I came up from that, and a couple of things that I thought were really interesting that they've talked about so far that I think will really impact HVRP. There's a lot of discussion about the role of income and employment, and that's actually a big piece of why I'm here, so that programs can really be thinking, these SSVF programs can really be thinking critically about how they connect with the HVRP grantees in their community, how they work more closely with the American Job Centers. It's a huge focus for the programs, and so I think that that's going to be really important. We also talked a little bit in last week's call about in the organizational capacity and experience section about the importance of hiring veterans to do your outreach and having veterans on staff. I thought it was very interesting that when they asked today, less than a third of the people who were in the room stood up and said that they were veterans. Now, maybe some folks didn't, you know, stand up who were veterans, but I just thought it was a good indication that you do have a considerable push from the civilian community to be very invested in ending veteran homelessness. So if you do see, you know, an applicant that doesn't have any veterans on staff or that part is limited, it's not necessarily a weakness because you've got these great programs that are doing amazing work. And I thought that was interesting. That's a significant change from a couple of years ago. The other piece, well, we'll just leave it at that so we can get started on the housing section here. Today we are going to talk. Yes.
Just before you do, we had just done a review of dual grant holders, that is HVRPs that also have an SSVF grant as part of their agency, and it looks like we're up 10% from last year. We found 41% of the HVRP grantees also have an SSVF. So that's
what's the actual number? The number of grantees, John?
I'll have to get that back to you. I don't have that number right in front of me. I have the slides up here, so we just did the research on it, and I'll shoot you an email that you can send out a little blurb about it.
Thanks.
No problem.
That's very exciting. You know, the other thing that we're looking at too is when you're talking about those overlaps, there are SSVF grantees in 400 of 416 continuums of care. So if there are 416 continuums in the country, 400 of them have an SSVF grantee. So you can assume that the large majority of HVRP applicants have SSVF in their community. It's a very, very rare case that there's no SSVF funding that's in their community. So they really should outline how they're connecting to that resource, either within their agency or externally, because that's, you know, that's a very high percentage there. I can't do the mental math, but it's a lot.
I'm hoping folks know what SSVF is. There may be some people on the call that don't know what it is.
Well, that's great because we're going to talk about it today in maybe some excruciating detail. Just kidding. We won't get too far into it, but we are going to talk about the role of SSVF today within the full housing spectrum. The goal of today, and, you know, feel free to toss information out there. In the housing piece of these trainings in particular, there's a real difference between the urban, highly resourced communities and those more rural communities that don't have access to a ton of resources that kind of cobble together what's available locally. You'll see that most profoundly, I would assume, in the housing section, as well as in the linkages section. The housing is a place where that those very urban areas, especially ones that are part of 25 cities, communities, and this big surge effort by VA to push resources into these high priority communities, they have considerably more housing resources than others. But we'll talk about the full spectrum just so that if you are reading an application and you see a resource listed, you have an idea of what that piece means and where it fits into the full spectrum of housing resources. So on the second slide, and hopefully everyone can see the slide. I hope it's working now. You'll see just the general scoring rubric that we've looked at quite a few times. I think we'll only look at it one more time in our time together later this afternoon. We're going to talk about that housing strategy section, which is worth 10 points in the SGA. Here's a little bit of what we're going to talk about. I want to spend some time talking about how Housing First has impacted the HVRP program as well as other programs that are serving veterans who are homeless and what kind of movement that's making in local communities across the country. There's a good, solid connection between housing and employment. It's no coincidence that when efforts to end veteran homelessness really began, our resources were twofold, HVRP and grant and per diem, so an employment resource and a housing resource. There are parallels between both of those models and how people are able to achieve success. As with what we've discussed, and we'll talk about more today, this afternoon, we talked about solid follow-up and retention. There has to be a very strong fit between the individual and the environment in order for the placement to be successful. That's a principle that obviously applies to the employment side of what the HVRP programs are doing, but they need to show that same model within their housing strategy. So there is no one-size-fits-all model for connecting veterans who are homeless or people who are homeless, people who are low-income and at risk to the permanent housing opportunities that are in their community. It really needs to showcase a full spectrum so that they're able to meet the individual needs of people who come in. Importantly, the housing must not only meet their immediate needs, but be shown to be progressive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Housing First component. But something that's been discussed here over and over again and that we're hearing from more and more HVRP programs is that they have a real defined role in not only helping veterans achieve housing success, but helping them maintain stability. When we talk about SSVF, you'll see that that resource offers temporary support for housing placement, but real housing stability comes from HVRP. It comes from employment and income so that veterans are able to maintain that housing status after they achieve housing. And the next slide on your spectrum of services within the continuum, this is probably familiar to you. I've shared this with you a couple of times. I think it's a useful resource just when you're thinking about the length of an intervention, what kind of role prevention plays in that mix, and what are the different kinds of housing options that you want to see reflected in an application. You want to see all four of these pieces. A change to this SGA, it was very specifically spelled out that programs need to show a connection to both permanent supportive housing and affordable permanent housing. And if you thought, well, I thought those were one and the same, the real difference between those pieces, your permanent supportive housing is something like a HUD-VASH voucher where you have the housing itself, but the individual who is in that unit is able to engage with a series of wraparound services that are available through a continuum of agencies and of providers that are working with that individual. HUD-VASH is the perfect model for that. So it's both permanent and supportive. There's housing, but it's also plus services, and that's the basis of a permanent supportive housing model. HUD-VASH is an example, but there are other examples that follow that model using both VA and HUD and also state and private funds. Affordable permanent housing models, and this is the majority of the housing placements that programs like SSVF achieve. This is placement into housing within the community. Sometimes it's affordable or rent-controlled. Other times it's in the competitive market. And this is where HVRP has a huge role to play. The majority of individuals who are accessing services are not going to be eligible for a permanent supportive housing resource. Those are very expensive and limited intervention tools, but most people, if they are able to achieve some level of income with the support of a program like SSVF, providing the move-in and the beginning starting expenses for their rent, are able to achieve housing within their community in the competitive housing market. In areas where there's a very low a very high occupancy rate. You might see a reference to that in a housing strategy. The availability of affordable permanent housing, so no voucher connected to it, is extremely limited. A great example is Washington, D.C. The number of affordable housing units in Washington, D.C. almost exactly matches the number of permanent supportive housing vouchers available. So that means in Washington, D.C., unless you have a permanent supportive housing voucher, there's no affordable housing available to you. So housing is extremely expensive there. You have other examples where you'll see that, like New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Tampa, and a couple places in Texas and in other places across the country. But be aware that you might have applicants that would talk about that very high occupancy rate. And that means that within their rental market, there are very few openings overall and very few affordable housing opportunities that are available. And so it takes a creative approach to providing housing, strong relationships with landlords in order to be able to deliver on that. This is another strength of their connection to, there being the applicant's connection to or, holding of an SSVF grant. A lot of those programs might have a housing specialist, and that person's whole job is to go out and engage with landlords in the competitive housing market. That offers them the opportunity to open up additional affordable housing units that would not otherwise be available to veterans. So if you're taking a look at the spectrum, your most immediate resource would be your emergency shelters. The next step up from that, and those, are sometimes veteran-specific, but not always. Sometimes they're connected to the faith community. There's a lot of flexibility in what emergency housing might look like. Increasingly, because of changes within the SSVF program, some grantees might talk about placement in emergency housing. So they might put someone in a hotel or a motel for a short period of time if there are no other emergency housing resources that are available within that community. That might be something to be on the lookout for. But again, emergency housing can be very flexible. Sometimes it's veteran specific, sometimes not. Your transitional housing is likely one of two pieces, and we'll talk about both of them later. But that's a shorter term intervention. Often someone can stay there for up to 24 months. But with the push toward housing first and getting people rapidly into housing, oftentimes they're in transitional housing for a shorter period of time. This is a little bit more of an intensive intervention than emergency housing, which is basically just housing. Oftentimes the veteran or the person who's in the unit has to, has to vacate in the morning. They can come back in the evening. With transitional housing, that's more of a comprehensive approach. Oftentimes there are structured programs that go along with it that include employment services, connection to benefits, and additional resources within transitional housing. So you can see that the length of that intervention would be a little bit longer than just the one-term stay in emergency housing. Then we move up to the permanent supportive housing realm, and for those vouchers, which we'll talk about later, in those programs, that's a much longer-term intervention. It's a costlier resource, and so it's targeted to those veterans who are chronically homeless and who have the highest needs in areas with very limited affordable housing options. So if you have programs that are proposing to serve female veterans or veterans with dependents, oftentimes they can be in receipt of permanent supportive housing resources because it's so difficult for them to achieve housing in their market. Does anyone have any questions on the spectrum? So you want to see, no matter where the applicant is, that they have some sort of every one of these four pieces. All of those are critical to achieving housing success, to helping every veteran achieve housing success. They might not have every, 5 or 6 items that's listed that we're going to talk about within each one of these pieces, but they should have some part of every one of these four. It's going to be really difficult for them to be successful if they don't. So this slide, which I got from John, so thanks, John, Now, when a program is talking about how they determine who would be a right fit for which housing, you might see reference to the coordinated intake, the coordinated access system that the community has. Again, this mostly applies to those communities that have more intensive technical assistance and training efforts that are going on in their communities. There's an effort in these places to set up what's called a coordinated access or coordinated intake system. So no matter where a veteran comes into the system, he or she is immediately enrolled in basically a spreadsheet, a data system where the individual providers that are in that community can choose which one of them would be the best fit for working with that individual. Part of that process involves a pretty thorough assessment. Their assessment tools might differ, but the important part of that is within the coordinated intake process, every veteran who comes through it is assessed for what their housing need is so that they're directed to the right housing resource. Some people might be a great candidate for permanent supportive housing because the veteran has been chronically homeless, been out on the streets for a long period of time, and so the assessment would gear them more toward the permanent supportive housing side, that intensive intervention. Whereas if you had someone who came into the coordinated intake system and was assessed, and they could probably be helped with rapid rehousing, so maybe a short-term limited intervention, they just need help beefing up their resume, going out on some interviews, they need a few months help with rents through SSVF or another community resource, and they'd be back on their feet. That's a less intensive intervention. So you might not see a coordinated intake discussed in your applications, but if you do, that gives you a sense of what it is. It's a process by which individuals come into the system, are assessed for their right fit in different housing interventions, and are then referred to those appropriate interventions so that the system's data is communicating across organizations. In an ideal world, it doesn't work perfectly everywhere. It's a work in progress in a lot of communities. So if we're looking at the housing resources, they've changed very significantly in the last couple of years. And so all of these pieces are ones that we're going to just touch on briefly today. So the programs that have been doing this since the very beginning, when I talked earlier about that critical connection between housing and employment, how they've been the two pinnacle pieces in helping veterans get off the streets since the beginning of this movement, even before the 5-year plan, before high-intensity effort to end veteran homelessness on the national scale. There were really only two housing interventions that were available, and they were both limited, and that's your grant and per diem program and your HUD-VASH, and we'll talk about those. With the launch of the 5-year plan, there was an explosion of resources around housing, and these are the ones that we'll discuss. So there was the grant and per diem program expanding, but also being targeted in different ways through transition in place and special needs grants. HUD-VASH grew exponentially. We actually just sent out a notice a couple of days ago that there will be another round of HUD-VASH vouchers that are being pushed into communities, so those should be going out pretty soon. I'm sure you'll hear from your HVRP grantees about veterans who they wanted to enroll but who were leased up with HUD-VASH too quickly. Those challenges come up often. You'll probably hear about that within the next 2 months or so as those vouchers are moved pretty quickly into communities. The continuum of care also changed to better integrate with veteran needs. So there was an increased focus within continuum of care resources on having veterans programs at the table for planning, having veterans programs at the table for continuous operations, even the writing of the continuum of care plans, and also targeting continuum of care resources to veterans who were not otherwise able to be served by the VA system. So veterans that maybe weren't eligible because of their discharge status, time of service, and those kind of pieces. There's also a third piece that we'll just touch on briefly, and that's because it's so variable. That's the growth of private housing initiatives. There are partners within philanthropy. There was changes within the rental market as a result of the financial crisis and the move by several large lending institutions to make properties available to nonprofit organizations. There were resources that were brought in through partners like the Home Depot Foundation, City Community Development, Bank of America, JP Morgan, and a couple of the large institutions to really support increased housing availability for veterans who were homeless without using federal funds. So leveraging those federal funds but not focusing in on those. And those have had a huge impact on the availability of housing that's affordable for veterans in their local communities. As the housing market has started to recover and the economy has started to recover, those initiatives have, at least those that are turning over properties to nonprofits and to veterans who are low income and homeless, have slowed a bit, but they're still prevalent, and you might see those referenced, especially for some of your larger providers that talk about having their own housing stock as a part of their organization's portfolio. Do you have any of your programs that already have grant per diem transitional housing within their agency? GPD is the only program where there's no publicly available list of grantees. So, you know, we know who the HVRP programs are. We know who the SSVF programs are, but, you know, we're still unsure of every single grant per diem program out there. Does anyone know of one of their programs working with grant and per diem? Did they ever talk about that in their service applications?
Yeah, this is Ken. It's my understanding that most of the HVRP programs got their start as GPD grantees. Yes. So a large percentages, I would estimate probably in the neighborhood of 40 to 50%, maybe higher, still have GPD grants that they operate internally on site and house the veterans themselves.
Yep, that's definitely the case, Ken. A lot of the HVRP programs did start with GPD. That was one of the bedrock resources, and that was all that was available on the federal funding side for these communities. And grant per diem is transitional housing. That means a veteran can come in, they can be in the program for up to 2 years. They can be asked to contribute some of their income toward rent. It really depends on the program. There are about a little over 14,000 beds across the country. So it's not quite a grant program. The way that it works is the organizations receive a per diem for each individual who's there per day. It's around $43 per day for every veteran who's in that program. Grant per diem is transitional housing, so they're still technically housed, according to VA and others. That's how they're counted as sheltered homeless. So veterans who are in grant per diem transitional housing are eligible for enrollment in HVRP, but them being placed into transitional housing in the grant per diem is not a permanent housing placement. So it's still transitional. They're still technically homeless. A couple important pieces to note is VA has cut back on the grant and per diem beds that are available in communities. So some agencies that maybe the last time you reviewed their application or the last time they had a grant, maybe they had 15, 20, 100, 200 grant and per diem beds, and it really is that variable, anywhere from 6 beds up to 300. Some of those programs have since lost their grant and per diem beds. If you see that change, if they talk about it in their application, that's not necessarily a weakness of the program. VA did an analysis of the need in some communities and in areas where there simply isn't the need for that transitional housing resource. It's being met through other means in the community. They have cut back on grant and per diem funding in some of those communities. So know that if you see an applicant that talks about, we had grant and per diem, we no longer have it, but here's how we're still meeting that need, it doesn't necessarily mean that the applicant or that program did anything wrong. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong. They may have done something that caused them to lose their funding, but know that that is something that's happening across the country, that beds are being decreased nationwide depending on how the homeless veteran population is declining in that community. Anyone have any questions on transitional housing?
Just before we move on, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John.
Well, I just want to make note that, the last bullet about the connection to HVRP, not only are GPDs and HVRPs often operated by the same agency, the GPD program has made employment a priority and measures employment at exit for residents, for people who are using these transitional beds. And at this point, they've exceeded their goal. The GPD nationally sees 44% of the residents leave GPD with employment. So that's in a good direction, and in no doubt a large part of that is due to the connection and partnership with the HVRP services. So I wouldn't be surprised if they start inching that goal up higher to closer to 50% as the program still moves forward.
Hey John, this is a note, could we get some analysis of that over the next couple of months? Because I'd like to share that with management, because that would show how labor and VA have partnered together to help solve homelessness.
We could delve into the relationship between GPD and HVRP and some anecdotal stories and the things that are happening. Just as Bailey said, I was just down in Palm Beach, and they've had a significant reduction in GPD beds, but because of the need has decreased. And they're doing more with permanent housing. So I think we could do something, Ken, that might be informative as the shifting face, if you will, of GPD and HVRP. We'll put it on the to-do list.
Yeah, I like that one. And, Grant Per Diem is a unique resource because up until a couple of years ago, because it was one of the only tools out there for housing for veterans who were homeless, their real focus was on how are they serving the veterans who were in the program. They didn't focus as much on tracking the data on who was discharged to where, what was their employment status when they left. Some of that information hadn't really been tracked historically with the program, and so now they've reoriented the way their data is being captured, and the data junkie in me gets very excited about that. So that we have some more information about where veterans are going when they leave GPD. So I think that would be an exciting thing to look at.
And people should be aware just that GPD is not a grant program, but it's a contract between the local VA medical center and the provider in the community. So it's literally a contract for these transitional beds. And it's monitored by a VA staff person locally.
Yeah, that's a good point, too. So when they're talking about their linkages, if they're talking that they have all these GPD units, but they have a horrible relationship with their VA Medical Center's homeless program staff, there's definitely a disconnect there because GPD works on a daily basis with the Grant Per Diem liaisons that are at the medical center. So there are two specialized components to GPD that are worth mentioning. They're limited in the resources and in their reach, but you might see mention of them and just thought that they were important to put out there. Grant Per Diem's Transition in Place program, this was a 3-year pilot that put 450 beds into the community. They were trying something new within the confines of the flexibility of the Grant Per Diem program as it was written. The way that works is a veteran moves into a unit, usually a private unit like it would be an apartment, but at that point they're still in a transitional stage. They're still technically homeless because the unit that they're living in, they're still receiving those intensive services from the Grant Per Diem agency. At some point, the services will leave. They might still have case management going on, but the services will leave, and the veteran stays in that unit, maybe taking on a lease or some other agreement with the agency that's in charge of that unit. And at that point, the individual is permanently housed. So it's transition in place because they're moving from the streets to in transition to permanently housed, but the only movement is from the streets into the housing unit, and the services are the piece that leaves. If you do have an organization that talks about transition in place, They should outline how they make sure veterans are enrolled in HVRP before the veterans transition from the transitional stage into the permanently housed stage. Again, that needs to be within that 2-year period, within that 24-month period. So you'll want to see how they outline it. But this is a limited resource. There are only 450 beds. It was just recently extended. So again, another very useful resource, but limited. I guess I don't have the stuff in there on the special needs grants, but just talking about the GPD special needs grants, this is another sunset, especially with your applicants that are proposing to serve veterans with dependent children or female veterans. The Grant Per Diem special needs grants were kind of like GPD plus for some programs. So organizations that already had GPD were provided with additional funding to serve target populations. So this included female veterans, and it also included, when we're looking at overlap with HVRP, frail elderly veterans and those with serious debilitating conditions, so severe mental illness and so on. The special needs programs, again, were very limited, and those are still continuing on now. An agency that is proposing to serve female veterans as a target population, proposing to serve chronically homeless veterans, proposing to serve aging veterans who are on the streets. If they have a special needs grant that's geared toward that purpose, they have additional resources to make sure those individuals' housing needs are being met. Again, this is still transitional housing, but it's transitional housing plus, so it's additional focused funding so that they can help those target populations. So moving right on up from transitional housing into the permanent housing piece. And our HUD-VASH resource is the biggest resource for permanent supportive housing. The way this resource works is you've got a permanent supportive housing voucher that comes from HUD, from Housing and Urban Development, and it's paired with case management from the VA Medical Center. So the voucher, the way the process works is the voucher comes down from HUD National down to the Public Housing Authority. The Public Housing Authority, working in coordination with the medical center, will have a list of identified veterans who are eligible for and needing this resource. And then goes one of two ways. The veteran either receives the HUD-VASH voucher and either on their own or hopefully with some assistance by a peer navigator or a community program, go out and find a landlord that's willing to accept that voucher, which is basically a ticket to housing. The veteran will be expected to pay up to 30% of their income. Sometimes they pay nothing. Sometimes they pay a significant amount as long as they stay below the income threshold. In other cases, the housing voucher will come into the Public Housing Authority. The Housing Authority will give that to an agency to develop a new affordable housing project. So you'll have a housing complex that was built using HUD-VASH vouchers as a leverage mechanism to find the funding for additional housing. Those are called project-based vouchers. The first one is called tenant-based vouchers. So that veteran, when they are assessed by the VA Medical Center and they are sometimes put on a waiting list for HUD-VASH, when that resource is made available to those veterans, they're able to achieve housing within their community, and it's paid for by HUD, and the case management is paid for by VA. It's expected that VA case managers will have a very small caseload. In a lot of communities, it's not the case. It's a difficult position to do, and so there tends to be some vacancy in those jobs. So you might see an applicant that will talk about, how they work with their medical center very closely to help ensure that the right veterans are being referred for HUD-VASH placement. It's a very limited resource because it's an intensive intervention, so it's targeted mostly to veterans who are chronically homeless. I believe it's over 70% of veterans who receive HUD-VASH vouchers are chronically homeless, categorized as chronically homeless. I think it's almost up to 90% of the total. But again, another award of these just came out think it's around, Randy, is it 10,000 around? Do you remember from the announcement?
9,000, I think.
9,000? All right, so there's 9,000 vouchers that are going out into communities. Those will go, it takes a little bit of time. Those go from HUD to the 300 or so public housing authorities that are part of this process, and then veterans will begin to receive those vouchers. HUD-VASH lease-up is permanent housing. So your applicants, I know we've talked about this in previous years, but just to reiterate it, applicants that are proposed, they should outline how they understand the HUD-VASH program and how they're going to make sure that they get veterans enrolled in HVRP before they're leased up with HUD-VASH. Because as soon as that veteran spends one night in their apartment unit, as soon as that lease is signed and they're in their unit, they're no longer considered homeless and they are not eligible for HVRP enrollment. Some of the places where programs have seen this be challenging is they'll enroll a veteran who's living in a shelter, transitional housing, on the streets, work with them throughout the year. At some point during that program year, the veteran receives a HUD-VASH voucher, leases up. They still aren't employed at the end of the program year, but the HVRP program will want to re-enroll them in the new program year. At that point, they're living in a housing unit. They're no longer eligible because they're permanently housed. We've had to tell programs over and over again, you can't do that. They're not eligible. They're permanently housed. So know that that they should be able to outline how they understand HUD-VASH and how they're going to make sure that they're referring veterans to that resource, but that veterans who are eligible and willing to participate in HVRP are enrolled before that lease-up process happens. It used to not be a huge challenge a couple of years ago because that timing from when they were first referred to HUD-VASH to the VA for HUD-VASH assessment to when they were actually leased up with HUD-VASH could take several months. Now in communities, because there's a big push toward rapid lease-up and housing first principles, which is housing first, move the person right into housing, and then wrap services around them to make sure that they're secure, that lease-up time is considerably shorter. So a program might come into contact with the veteran, and then 3 days later that veteran's leased up in an affordable housing unit and no longer eligible for enrollment. Has anyone had any struggles with HUD-VASH or have any guidance to give others on the committee on what to look for with HUD-VASH?
Hey, this is Ken. I consider the grantee that has a HUD-VASH strategy or utilizing HUD-VASH vouchers, that's a high-performance grantee in the housing and the homeless housing strategy, if you will, for this application. However, as you mentioned, they have to think strategically about how they use that resource. But that's just my input.
No, I think that's very important. It's, they should talk about it, but they need to be talking about it the right way. So if they're saying, well, there's 200 HUD-VASH units that are going to come online in the next year in my community, and I'm going to enroll every veteran who's in all those units, they don't quite have a solid understanding of the process of how that's going to go, and it might, throw off how their outreach strategy is set up and their enrollment strategy is set up and really shows a misunderstanding of how the HUD-VASH program works because it is permanent housing. Increasingly, the housing recovery plans that are created within the HUD-VASH case management process also include income. Not always is there a focus on the role of employment, but increasingly, and we keep pushing for that, and I know John and his team does too, that they need to be helping veterans who are going into HUD-VASH units, help them achieve income so that they're able to graduate from those units. Oftentimes, veterans will lease up with HUD-VASH. It can be an isolating experience for them if they're not otherwise connected to their community, and sometimes veterans will end up losing those HUD-VASH vouchers because they choose to go back out to the streets where they have that community. So we've made the case over and over again that being involved in the world of work is a way to help people reconnect to that purpose and how important that is in addition to helping them achieve independence. It's a way for veterans to be connected to their community and have that longer-term stability. Over and over again, when we're talking about the connection between housing and income, it's about long-term stability for veterans who are part of these programs. So just a quick note on the Supportive Services for Veteran Families program, SSVF, because I know we've talked about this a lot over the last couple of days. The focus of the SSVF program is twofold. There's a rapid rehousing component to it, and there is also a prevention component to it. The rapid rehousing component is focused on quickly identifying veterans who are homeless, on the street, and sheltered, and moving them into permanent housing using a housing-first philosophy. So identify, rapidly assess, determine what's the appropriate referral for that person, and get them quickly into housing without preconditions, lowering the barriers as much as possible. That's the pinnacle of the rapid rehousing process. The SSVF grantees, as I mentioned earlier, have very strong relationships with landlords through the other work that they do. Many of them operate other HUD-funded housing programs, and so they have a solid understanding of the housing market in their local community. I thought it was interesting, another question that got raised today was how many of the SSVF programs also serve other populations of individuals who are homeless, and it was over half the group. So the majority of your SSVF grantees do have that solid experience with serving the homeless population, and so they'll be informed of a lot of the other resources that might be available to veterans, even if they're not veteran specific. That rapid rehousing component is the big push for the SSVF program at the current time. The prevention component is a smaller piece of it because right now as we're pushing to the end of the 5-year plan, we really want to get as many veterans into housing as possible. But the prevention component is focused on helping those individuals who are at high risk of homelessness maintain their housing stability. So for veterans who are extremely low income, far low AMI, helping those veterans maintain their housing stability. And again, so SSVF has those two pieces to it. There's slightly different eligibility requirements for the SSVF program and the HVRP program. And so you'll want to see an applicant that shows a solid understanding of who should be enrolled when. They want to be able to showcase there are income restrictions on enrollment with enrollment with SSVF. So you'll want an applicant to showcase how they will enroll a veteran in the SSVF program, start getting them set up with services before they move into permanent housing. They're enrolled in the HVRP program, and then they're rapidly moved into housing. So if they are talking about leveraging SSVF funds, you do want to see how they're outlining that process working so they show that they have a clear understanding of the eligibility. We have some resources on those eligibility overlaps. Happy to share those with you and make them available and answer any questions that you have. We get a lot of questions from grantees on this overlap. Oftentimes it's just case-by-case basis, is this person eligible and when? But they do need to show that collaboration. An important note here is if you have an applicant who has SSVF within their agency, don't automatically assume that that means they work closely together. We know several HVRP programs that struggled because they had HVRP and SSVF in the same agency. The two programs never met, didn't communicate. So they need to go beyond the lip service of saying we have both of these and instead say we're going to meet once a week. We already do meet once a week. We have a coordinated data system, so we know every person who's part of our agency who's enrolled in both programs. They should also outline how they're going to leverage both resources in service to things like transportation costs. The SSVF program can pay for some transportation, can pay for some cost of training, some equipment, in addition to things like move-in fees or a couple of months' rent. So you'll want to see how they outline the services that would be provided through the SSVF program to the veterans who are enrolled in their HVRP. John, is there anything else you wanted to mention on SSVF? Did I forget anything that's important there?
No, you got it.
And on the services side, SSVF on the rapid rehousing side can help with things like moving expenses, sometimes storage units, but the bulk of that funding is used for rental supports, usually up to 5 months, or utility supports, either back-owed utilities or the deposits in the first couple of months on utility payments. So that's mostly what the program is for. It's a shorter-term intervention. That's a big piece on SSVF. Here's basically what I just talked about. You have that too. We don't have a ton of time, so I'll just mention a couple of the HUD resources that they might talk about. Some agencies, as I mentioned, leverage other housing resources outside of what's available from VA. So they might talk about ESG grants, emergency solution grants from HUD. This program changed a little bit, but you'll see that there is some overlap with what we just talked about with SSVF, how ESG grants can pay for things like outreach, emergency shelter, some prevention and rapid rehousing system, and helping programs integrate their data through HMIS. So what you see with the emergency solution grants is similar to what you see with SSVF, but there's that emergency housing component to it. And this is not veteran-specific. It's mainstream HUD funding, but it's another resource that the community might be able to leverage. On the continuum of care side, these are the units that we talked about earlier that conduct the point-in-time counts. The continuum of care is required to serve those veterans who are not eligible for VA health care. So some of the veterans who are enrolled in HVRP might not be eligible for VA benefits, for VA medical care, but the programs will still need to get veterans connected to those resources so that they could be successful in achieving employment and getting back to being an independent part of their community. So you do want to see that connection between an HVRP program and the continuum of care in their community, because they will need to be able to make those referrals to other agencies within the community, within the continuum of care. The way the continuum of care works is basically a block of funding that comes down to districts, and you'll see the state breakdowns here. I often think of continuum of care like congressional districts. They're broken down in a similar way where every part of the country is covered by a continuum. These continuums receive a block of funding from HUD to provide various services. There's usually one agency or a couple agencies that are in charge of administering those funds, and they provide services to different focus groups, including veterans, but also including families, youth homelessness, people with severe mental illness, single adults, and so on. So it's a larger HUD program that includes services for veterans. Your continuum of care might have a local planning committee where the veteran program is represented on it. This is what we talked about earlier with an organization showcasing that they have very strong community connections. If they are part of the planning committees for their continuum of care, if they're part of maybe a veteran subcommittee of their continuum of care, if they're one of the grantees within the continuum of care, it's like a consortium of grantees, those would be strengths within your application. Anything I'm missing on the continuum of care piece, John? John's the big expert on continuum of care. I should have made him go over that part, but that's just what it is in a nutshell. It's access to additional resources, providing the full spectrum of services.
I think just making sure that when you're reading an application that you see the words continuum of care and you see that the applicant has a relationship and that they articulate what that relationship is. And every application should have that. That's long been expected in HVRP applications, and this year is no exception. So, and the more detail they provide you, it's a stronger signal that they are integrated with the continuum of care, and that's what we want. We don't want to see them, parallel programs or siloed programs, but we want to see them working together.
Yeah, very good point. And this is one of the resources where your rural programs, your non-urban programs, they're at a disadvantage in some of the work that they do. I mentioned that the entire country is broken up into continuums of care. in a state like Wyoming, there might be one continuum of care that's centralized around a major population center, and then the rest of the state is covered by what's called a balance of state continuum of care. So in those states where there is not high concentrations of veterans who are, or individuals who are homeless, within a certain area, they'll have something that's called a balance of state, which is just basically everything else in the state.
A good example of that, Bailey, is in Texas. There may be a dozen continuums of care, but the balance of state represents 213 counties. So it's huge. So they obviously can't have the same level of participation in the way that a smaller jurisdiction of 2 counties might have.
Yeah, exactly. That was actually the example I was going to use. Texas is the perfect example for that because the balance of state is huge. So if you have a non-urban applicant, or even sometimes maybe some of your rural applicants, if they talk about the challenge of working with the balance of state continuum, they should at least show some engagement, like maybe they participate on planning phone calls or quarterly meetings or something along those lines, because the continuum of care is still engaged. And some applicants will also likely outline continuum of care in their employment placement strategy. We always encourage HVRP grantees to ask the continuum of care agencies if they're hiring. It's always a great opportunity to get veterans hired back into the work that they've been involved with through HVRP. So you might see the continuum of care pop up in a couple places. Just a little bit more on that, on the continuum of care, what they do. This last slide here is just that there are other HUD programs that they might reference that are targeted to different populations, like HOPWA has to do with housing opportunities for individuals who are living with AIDS. Again, it's not veteran specific, but if they're targeting a high-need veteran population, they might mention that resource. There are some other tools available through VA, like the Home Loan Guarantee Program, that the applicants may mention. This is a resource that may help individual veterans. For the veterans we're working with, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of talk about the Home Loan Guarantee Program. The service provider themselves may use it to acquire those discounted properties, and then they can use those to provide housing for veterans. But you're probably not going to have a whole lot of programs that are focusing on helping veterans in their HVRP achieve home ownership. You may, but I'm guessing it's limited. We don't have a whole lot of time to go over these, but you'll have some of these resources available to you. When we're talking about veterans with very severe disabilities, you may see reference to domiciliary care for veterans. This is a much more intensive rehab setting for veterans with very severe disabilities. Safe havens are also another resource available through the VA that you may see referenced. Again, these are for very high-need populations, those who've experienced chronic homelessness, but also have significant disabling conditions. And we talked about OAS veterans and housing resources a while before. I think I covered housing first. As I mentioned, it's not just housing only. It's housing with that case management, but there's a rapid focus on getting individuals assessed and into the housing that's permanent, that meets their needs as quickly as humanly possible. It's some more focus on the harm reduction versus strict sobriety, so there are no preconditions to someone moving into housing. They're just getting moved in quickly. This impacts HVRP because as soon as a veteran is moved into permanent housing, they're not eligible for enrollment. So some of your communities where veterans are moving into housing very quickly, the programs are struggling to enroll enough veterans who would be in need of that resource. So you do want to see how they're addressing how they are enrolling veterans in HVRP while they're still eligible. And we talked a bit about the housing initiative, so I'll skip over that part. We got a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions on the housing piece of it, things you've seen, important points you want to note for the group? I know that's a lot, all in a very short period of time, but just wanted you to get a general snapshot of some of the pieces that you might see within that housing section. John or Ken, anything else you wanted to add on the housing piece that I might have missed, or just to reinforce?
You did a great job, and I think you covered everything thoroughly. So if you're on this call, please ask questions. We have the experts on the line. It's going to be a critical component of these applications, and please, please, please examine it thoroughly and try to choose the programs and award them for their housing strategies, and grade them low if they have a poor housing strategy.
Yeah, I can't reiterate that enough. They've got to have a solid housing strategy in place. They've got to be working closely with the veteran-specific and the larger Continuum and HUD programs that are providing housing. If they don't have that, even if they're a non-urban applicant, if they don't have that connectivity, it's going to be really, really challenging for them to be successful, for them to be good advocates for HVRP at the planning table for services. So they really need to have that strong housing section.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just if you're reading an application and the applicant is promising that they're going to help veterans get jobs and that's going to pay for and meet all of their housing needs, that's probably a little short-sighted in the reality of the circumstance, and that they should be talking about linkages with an array of housing options, not just market rate. It certainly should be part of the picture. But not relying totally on the job-getting activity of the veteran to pay for all of their housing needs just across the board. That would be, a little bit thin in terms of an argument.
Yeah, they're missing critical pieces if that's the end of the picture, because they're not addressing the move-in needs. Sometimes people have to pay for storage units and moving costs and buying toilet paper and shower curtains and all those pieces, and so they, should be outlining how they're working with local partners to make sure veterans are not just, achieving a job and that will pay for everything and solve all of their housing problems.
Just that referencing again that there almost any applicant will have access to an SSVF project in their community. At the very least, they should be talking about that connection, and so it would reflect an uninformed applicant if it's absent.
Yep.
Nice job, Bailey. I think it did cover everything in good detail, and a little overwhelming for everybody, but I think it's important to understand these issues as we try to, advance HVRP and the ending of veteran homelessness. It really has to be an employment and housing strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And as Ken mentioned, too, John and I are here. We are available as resources to you. Feel free to call and ask us questions about, these tools. I know that there are restrictions on when and what you can ask during the open grant period. So, be sure to run this by Ken first. But no, we really are here to clarify any of this information for you as you go forward in this process and as you're working with your grantees. What we've been bringing forward in these trainings are very much based on what we hear from grantees as their major challenge areas, the major resources that they use. So we really try to structure, this information so it covers what we think you're likely to see from applicants, both, the sneaky things that they might try to get away with and frame in a way that makes them sound stronger than they are, and some of those hidden strengths that are going to be really important for a successful applicant. So I will not be on the call this afternoon. Randy will be there for NCHV, so I just wanted to thank you all for your time and your attention during this whole process, and just as a reminder that, we are here to support you. That's what we're here for. Never hesitate to get in contact with us at any time throughout the year.
I'll be on the call this afternoon where we'll talk about follow-up and job retention strategies. And as always, your questions right now may be somewhat limited until you actually are sitting down, looking at the application. And I'm sure there will be ample opportunity for you to have conversation with Ken and with others in the CGET to try to address questions. And then, of course, Ken always has access to Bailey or myself to if any questions are warranted that we might have input on. So I thank everybody for continuing to participate in these training calls.
All right, thank you all. Have a great call this afternoon.
Thanks.
And happy grading.
Have a good one.
All right, bye-bye.